Okay, thank you. We are now in public session. So, as always, just to do the small announcements, just to remind members and witnesses, please, if you can turn off mobile phones, they do affect the quality of the sound quality and transmission. Thank you. I'd like to take the opportunity to welcome to the committee today Mark Cassidy, the Director of Economics and Statistics for the Central Bank of Ireland, and he is accompanied by John Flynn, the Head of Irish Economic Analysis, and Thomas Conifrey, Irish Economic Analysis. So I'd like to thank you all for making yourselves available to our committee today. Our Committee on Budgetary Oversight is to monitor the macroeconomic forecasts and development that affect the Irish economy. And today we are meeting with you as representatives from the Central Bank to consider your first quarterly report. So, can I just take the opportunity to go through the privilege statement? So, I just wish to advise you that by virtue of Section 17(2)(1) of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect to their evidence to the committee. However, if you are directed by the committee to cease giving evidence on a particular matter and continue to do so, you are entitled thereafter only to qualified privilege in respect to your evidence. You are directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that, where possible, you should not criticise or make charges against any person or entity by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. Members are also reminded of the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that they should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person outside the Houses or an official, either by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. So, with that important but necessary bit of privilege statement over, Mark, I would now like to invite you, if you could, make your opening statement, and we will then obviously open it up to committee members for questions.
Thank you, Chairman. Committee members, good afternoon, and I welcome the opportunity to appear before you today. As you mentioned in your introduction, I am joined by John Flynn on my right, who is Head of the Irish Economic Analysis Division, and Thomas Conifrey, who is Manager of Structural Macroeconomic Modelling, also from the Irish Economic Analysis Division. And I will start with a brief summary of the outlook for the economy and the macroeconomic forecasts set out in our recently published quarterly bulletin. So the Irish economy grew at a strong pace in 2018, which was supported by the strength of activity on the domestic side of the economy, as well as a relatively favourable international growth environment. And while headline GDP growth last year was distorted by the activities of multinational enterprises, the evidence from a range of domestic spending and activity indicators is that the economy overall grew robustly. And we estimate that growth in underlying domestic demand last year was around 6%. This strength of domestic activity has been underpinned by continuing strong and broad-based growth in employment, which has stimulated incomes and supported the growth of consumer spending, while the growth of key domestic components of investment, such as building and construction, has also accelerated. Looking ahead, and the Central Bank's latest forecast is that if a disorderly no-deal Brexit scenario can be avoided, then the outlook for the economy in the coming years remains broadly positive, though with some moderation of growth in prospect. And we now expect economic growth this year of 4.4%, with a moderation to 3.6% next year. And the moderation partly reflects the projected impact of a less favourable and more uncertain international growth environment, with prospects for growth in our main trading partners having been lowered in recent months, and also some dampening impact from the uncertainty associated with Brexit. And the moderation also partly reflects the limits imposed by domestic capacity constraints due to the tightening of conditions in the labour market. The latest published forecasts also represent a modest downward revision compared to our previous bulletin, which was published in October. So exports, private consumption and investment are all weaker than previously expected, while following Budget 2019, the contribution of government consumption to economic growth this year is stronger. The main impetus to growth in the coming years is expected to come from domestic demand, driven by further growth in employment and incomes, though some moderation in employment growth from current rates is also projected. And reflecting the moderation in employment growth, and with some uncertainty about economic prospects weighing on sentiment, The growth of consumer spending is projected to ease towards 2% over both this year and next. Turning to investment, and while overall investment has been quite volatile in recent years, primarily reflecting the activities of multinational enterprises, some key domestic components of investment, such as building and construction, have rebounded strongly. And while this growth is forecast to continue, the outlook for some other components, such as machinery and equipment investment, is more mixed, reflecting some negative impact from increased risks and uncertainty. And taken together, the growth of overall underlying investment spending is expected to moderate. And given the outlook for consumption and underlying investment, the growth of underlying domestic demand overall is projected to moderate and to grow by 4.1% this year and by 3.3% next year. On the external side, while exports grew strongly in 2018, with projected growth in trading partner countries being revised downwards, some moderation in export growth is also projected, with exports forecast to grow by 4.3% this year and 3.9% in 2020. With Brexit-related uncertainty weighing on demand, the weakness in the UK market evident last year is likely to persist. Turning to the outlook for the labour market, while moderation in the pace of employment growth in line with the outlook for aggregate demand is forecast, growth of 2.2% this year and 1.7% next year is set to exceed growth in the labour supply, which is expected to be around 1.5% in both years. And as a result, the unemployment rate is projected to drop from an average of 5.8% last year to an average of 4.9% this year and further to 4.7% in 2020. And as has been the case for some time, the gains in employment have been broad-based, with employment growing strongly in many parts of the services sector as well as construction. And in our central forecast, growth in employment, while moderating, will continue to be relatively broad-based. And given the outlook for employment, we also expect a further pickup in wages, which, combined with the expectations of modest inflation, should translate into higher real incomes and purchasing power for households. So we are forecasting the average increase in compensation per employee to increase from 2.8% last year to 3.4% this year and 3.6% in 2020. Turning to Brexit, we have previously published work examining the potential medium-term impact on the Irish economy of both an orderly transition to a World Trade Organization scenario and an orderly transition to a free trade area type agreement, such as the current withdrawal agreement. In our latest bulletin, and using our economic modelling tools, we have now also examined the possible macroeconomic implications of a sudden and disorderly Brexit on the outlook for the economy. Given the unprecedented nature of a no-deal Brexit, quantification here is highly uncertain, and this exercise represents a scenario analysis and not a forecast, in that it looks at what could happen under certain assumptions, not necessarily what is most likely to happen. But with a disorderly Brexit, significant additional frictions and costs arise. These result not only from the introduction of new trade arrangements, but also from a breakdown in some of the arrangements that make trade possible, for example, as a result of regulatory and customs issues, border infrastructure issues, and legal uncertainties. And this would be likely to have immediately damaging consequences for trade and the functioning of supply chains for production, distribution and retailing. Modelling and forecasting tools can be used to estimate the impact of long-run changes to trade arrangements, but they are less well suited for predicting these short-run effects and potential disruption arising from a breakdown in those arrangements, the scale of which would also be influenced by the ability of firms and retailers to adjust to any new arrangements, as well as any policy responses or mitigating actions taken as a result. And I mention this in order to emphasise the uncertainty inherent in these estimates. Nevertheless, it is clear that a no-deal scenario would have very severe and immediate disruptive effects, which would permeate almost all areas of economic activity. Certain sectors and regions will be disproportionately affected, particularly agriculture and food sectors, as well as border regions and other rural regions that have a heavy reliance on agriculture and a particular reliance on the UK as an export market. And we estimate that a disorderly Brexit could reduce the growth rate of the Irish economy by up to 4 percentage points in the first year. So given the current favourable forecasts for the economy as a result of domestic demand and the strong non-UK multinational sector, our assessment is that there would still be some positive growth in output this year and next, even under a no-deal scenario, but this would be materially lower than in the central forecast and closer to 1% growth in both years. Brexit is not the only risk to the Irish economic outlook, and other material domestic and external risks persist. On the domestic side, while some moderation in underlying domestic demand is in prospect following a period of strong growth, labour market conditions are still set to tighten further, and as the economy moves closer to full employment, there is a need to continue to guard against the risk that strong cyclical conditions give rise to overheating dynamics. On the external side, in addition to Brexit, there continue to be some clear downside risks facing the economy. The international economic outlook has weakened since the publication of our previous bulletin in autumn, while risks related to international trade and taxation persist. And given the position of Ireland as a small, highly open economy and the important role of multinational firms within the economy, changes in global trade, taxation and currency arrangements have an important bearing on the performance of the economy. So thank you very much for your attention. We are now available to take any questions.
Now, thank you very much, Mr. Cassidy, for that opening statement. I have a number of deputies which have indicated, so I'm just going to call on our first one, Deputy Lahart.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks, Central Bank officials, for your public service, all the work you've done on this. A couple of very brief questions. And they would have risen, they're the kind of questions we'd put to IFAC and the Governor and that over time, and the Minister himself. Do you think there's an over-reliance on corporation tax receipts? Might have a comment on that we could add to previous comments. It looks, things are getting maybe closer to, maybe we're in territory where the idea of a no deal really fall off the cliff edge. Brexit, dare I say, it may not be as strongly possible as previously feared, hopefully. The other two scenarios you talked about, you know, under WTO rules, and I'm just wondering, could you refresh a little bit in terms of your what you have to say with that? And the final point, myself and the Chairman were at the EU Parliamentary Week last week, and was it Commissioner or the Vice President of the European Investment Bank was talking. So there's two questions I wanted to raise. One was that public expenditure in capital programmes has shrunk by 20% really across the EU, and in terms of you know, investments in public infrastructure and our climate change obligations and challenges that face us. He was saying, you know, the private sector must be incentivised to lead in a lot of these big capital projects, but just maybe you may have a comment on that. And look, it's really good news on the employment figures, but again, we would have heard last week, in Europe, you're talking about like 30% to 40% youth unemployment in some of the you know, modern economies. Where are we at in youth unemployment? What's the trend and trajectory on that? And clearly we're nowhere near as big, but what do you think is accounting for that? Is youth unemployment rates, are they higher than the average employment rates? And just any comments you might have on that. Thanks, Chair.
Okay, thank you very much, Deputy. Let me address each of those four parts to the question in turn. So in terms of over-reliance on corporation tax, first, It is clear that there has been an unprecedented surge in corporation taxes since 2014-2015. The increase has been the order of 125%, such that revenues are now around €10 billion, which accounts for around 19% of overall corporation tax revenues. This is extremely high by historical standards, by international standards. I would say, first of all, that the increase in corporation taxes that we have seen is very welcome. I would say, second, that this corporation taxes, particularly for Ireland, given that they are 40% of them is paid by the top 10 multinational firms, they are an inherently volatile source of taxation revenue. We do not predict that there will be any decline in the level, but the volatility inherent in this source of revenue is that we just do not know what the future is for corporation tax revenues. There has to be some risk that the revenues, the share of revenues, will decline in the future.
Can I just
seek
a bit of clarity? Is that on the basis that maybe a company may decide to, market circumstances?
Yeah.
It's not to do with, so it's to do with maybe a fall in their market share, so they're not earning as much, as opposed to the way they account for. Am I right there?
There are a number of uncertainties. So the decline, first of all, I would emphasise we're not forecasting a decline.
Sure.
The uncertainty is the key element. A decline could come around because of either firm or sector-specific circumstances. It could come around because of a decline in the global deterioration in the global trading environment, or it could come around because of a change in the international taxation environment, the way in which international, and Ireland participates fully, of course, in global taxation regimes and environments. So there are a number of possible sources of uncertainty. So our advice has always been that it is very likely that some element of the surge in corporation tax revenues over the past 4 to 5 years could represent a temporary or transient windfall element, and that it will be much more prudent for that element to be put aside and saved rather than, in particular, being committed towards permanent expenditure increases. In fact, the increase in corporation taxes, the extent of the increase in corporation taxes is very similar to the surge we saw in construction taxes prior to the boom, and in fact the increase in corporation taxes has contributed 40% to the overall increase in tax revenue since 2014-2015, which is very significant. So,
I'm sorry, Mr. President, can I ask you just for clarification? My understanding is there's a completely, disproportionate level of the figures in terms of what the property taxes prior to the boom amounted to in terms of overall government revenue compared to corporation tax at this point.
The figures I have in my mind are that while corporation tax revenues are 19% of total revenues, housing-related taxes accounted for about 16-17%.
Tax. Are you sure prior to 2008?
One figure is that if you look at the share of corporation tax revenue from the top 10 pairs, that's roughly equivalent to the share of revenue accounted for by stamp duties in 2006.
Sorry, let's look at what corporation tax is in its totality here for a second, rather than top 10 pairs, and compare. I think it's very important if we're trying to do apples and oranges here. So the share of corporation tax overall as a percentage of the budget of tax revenue in the budget is currently
19%.
And the share overall of what property tax was prior to 2008.
I have, and we'll get back to you with the exact figure. I have that overall housing-related taxes 16 to 17%. So let me get back to you on that. But income tax always dominates in terms of what it contributes. So I think it is roughly similar in terms of the amount. But whether that is housing as opposed to overall property, and there might be an element on top of that, let me get to confirm that.
Thank you.
Yeah. Sorry. So we would have concerns about the degree of reliance, and while we welcome the high amount of taxes, we think the prudent course of action is not to be spending what could turn out to be a temporary source of revenues. On your second question, you refer to the other scenarios. So yes, first of all, we think that some form of deal is a more likely outcome than a disorderly no-deal Brexit. The two other scenarios you refer to are, first, that some form of deal, such as a withdrawal agreement, materialises. In this case, you would see a transition period until end 2020, and after that, some restrictions in trade coming into effect, but free trade and therefore no tariffs between the economies. Under those circumstances, we think that the long-term impact on output would be that output would be around 1.7% lower than under a scenario where Brexit had not taken place, and that employment would be around 19,000 persons fewer than under a no-Brexit scenario. The other scenario you mentioned is that there is no deal, but there is a transition period until that no-deal scenario. So under those circumstances, the impact on output over the longer term is that output will be around 3.2% lower than under a no-Brexit scenario, and around 50,000 fewer jobs.
So if there's the best of all possible worlds from our perspective, which is a soft,
yes,
okay. What's the...
Yeah, so that first scenario whereby if you have the withdrawal, so a withdrawal agreement could ultimately lead to either a customs union type agreement or it could lead to a free trade type deal. The impact on the overall economy is rather similar, so that will be around 1.7% less growth over the medium term and around 19,000 fewer jobs. The third part of your question in relation to public investment. So overall public capital investment fell extremely sharply after the crisis. It fell by around 60%, and as a result there was a significant depletion of the overall public capital stock, which remains very low now. There is now the opportunity, after several years of very strong growth, there is certainly the opportunity for an increase in public capital investment. This can have, we presume, this can have the positive effect of increasing productivity across the economy and also be used to attain regional objectives. And we support the National Development Plan in terms of what is projected out to 2017. It is, from an economic perspective, if the private sector participates in that, it is very useful in terms of risk sharing across the economy, in terms of I suppose the kind of business incentives that can bring. So hopefully the private sector can be involved over the coming years. I think the public capital investment plan has to be set out regardless, because we do need now to address our public capital stock. To the extent that can be done with, in collaboration with the private sector, I think that would be welcome. For us, the key element with regard to public capital investment, we would fully welcome it, but we do need to acknowledge that it is now occurring at the time when the economy is operating at close to full capacity. If the full benefits of this capital investment are to be enjoyed, then it is important that the public capital investment does not crowd out the private sector. And it can do this by contributing to capacity constraints for private producers, or it can do that if higher capital spending, if it is debt financed, will have the effect, when the economy is close to full capacity, of pushing up both prices and wages, which is it makes the private sector less competitiveness, particularly exporters. So our recommendation very firmly in that regard is that rather than debt financing under these circumstances, it is better if public capital investment is met by financing from elsewhere in the budget, whether taxation or other expenditure measures. In terms of youth unemployment, Thomas, would you like to?
Yeah, sure. So you're right that there was a very big increase in the rate, much higher than the average unemployment rate. So it went into the 20s.
Here.
Yeah, here. But it has fallen very significantly. So I think it's currently around twice the average unemployment rate. So it's high, but has fallen a lot. And one positive development is that a phenomenon we saw during the boom was the tendency for young males in particular to go out of education and straight into employment, particularly in the construction and related sectors. And what you see now, if you look at the data, is that the tendency for that to happen has declined a lot. So the labour force participation rate for young males and also for young females, but for young males in the 15 to 19 age group, fell quite significantly in 2008 and 9 and hasn't recovered. So in one sense you might think that's a negative, but when we look at the data, it seems to be that the major reason for that is that they're staying on in education, which of course is a benefit in the long run. So improvements in youth unemployment, but also maybe more significantly we're seeing greater tendency for younger age cohorts to continue in education, which benefits their earnings and their employment prospects longer term.
Thanks, Chair.
May I just confirm the previous figure that I gave you, because my colleague has helpfully provided that yes, in 2006 housing-related taxes indeed were 16% of the total. I think that confirms what I mentioned earlier. So.
Thank you. Now I have Deputy Broughan is next up.
I'd just like to welcome the delegation. Just to ask you, first of all, I mean, what really is the difference between a scenario analysis and a forecast? Because is it a case really that you're kind of hedging your bets in relation either to a cliff edge Brexit or to various types of, we'll say, softer Brexits, which will really impact hard on us probably after the end of 2020? I mean, we note that Commissioner Oettinger, for example, said that the no deal would probably lead to a general recession. So I presume various, quarter after quarter after quarter of declining output. So, I mean, isn't the cliff edge really a sort of existential threat to our economy? We've seen, for example, the anxiety, to put it mildly, that the farming sector has, which if you take our intrinsic domestic economy, it's a kind of a huge bedrock of how the economy works. So, are you being too sanguine really about your either your scenarios or your actual forecast? That's the first point I just wanted to raise. Do you think, in relation to Budget 2019, and we've been asking about the revised estimates and so on, and the possibility of another budget, I mean, has the government taken on board sufficiently the kind of, again, profound risks that we are this day next month that we'll be just days away from possibly, or we'll possibly know something if we can know anything from Westminster in the next couple of weeks. Just to say, I mean, also that I think the great Fintan O'Toole says, like, geography is destiny. And Napoleon once said, when he wouldn't send us troops to help us to get rid of the English yoke, I think 200 years ago, he said, Ireland's O'Neill, derriere O'Neill. I mean, isn't it the case that after Brexit, like it's going to be a profound impact on us? We're up there in the North Atlantic Ocean, and there's this huge economy right there between us, and our partners are that much further away. There's all kinds of logistics issues that we're going to have to try and unravel, whether it's Irish ferries going out of Dublin Port, going out of Rosslare, and so on and so forth. And just to take a case in point, I mean, the Governor, Professor Lane, he spoke, I think, at the European Financial Forum, talking about the financial sector. And he said, he feels the last few years that the financial sector, it has become strong enough maybe to withstand very profound shocks. But he just goes through a number of the issues that we deputies were highlighting last night and today, because we're doing the omnibus legislation at the moment, and we all have this sense of unreality, discussing huge areas of tax law and so on that we don't know whether they're going to be implemented or not. But just in relation to finance, obviously the stock market situation, the situation in insurance, and that whole area which the bank has a core role in. Again, we just wonder about its kind of viability going forward. And just final point then, just in relation, what's your estimates of in any of these kind of scenarios, what's your estimates of the levels of household debt going into the early 2020s?
Yep.
Thanks, Carol.
Okay, thank you very much, Deputy. I will give an initial answer in relation to the first question, and then Thomas might talk more technically about scenario versus forecast, and then I will come back to the second two questions. We do make a point of emphasising the inherent uncertainty relating to the estimates of the disorderly no-deal Brexit. There is no prior example of such a large economy suddenly withdrawing from such a large trading bloc. Our economic models are useful in terms of projecting medium-term and long-term outcomes based on historical relationships. They are less good at predicting short-term outcomes of this sort when you have such uncertainty events. So I would very much emphasise, reiterate the uncertainty around these. What we are projecting is a major impact in the first 2 years after Brexit. We are projecting that economic growth over the 2 years combined, rather than being something above 8%, would instead be something closer to maybe 2%. So a 6 percentage points, about 3/4 of the growth taken off the economy in the first 2 years, which is a major impact. So I would certainly hope that we are not underplaying the extent of the estimate. Our estimates are somewhat more adverse than those projected by the Department of Finance for the first year. But I would reiterate the uncertainty. Projected growth, therefore, of 1.5% could be somewhat above, could be somewhat lower than that. But this is a shock that would permeate almost all areas of economic activity. We know about the direct impact upon exports. Particularly those parts of the economy that are, first of all, a high share of their produce is exported to the UK. There are certain sectors of the economy which are particularly vulnerable, both to tariffs, but also the type of trade frictions, what we call non-tariff barriers, delays in moving goods into and out of the country. And there's absolutely no doubt that the sector that is most affected in that regard would be the farming, agricultural and food producing sectors. So around half of the around 42% of the exports of the food sector go to the UK. Many parts of that sector, particularly beef, are already suffering problems, are encountering problems with their viability even before Brexit comes into effect. The food sector is subject to the highest tariffs of any type of products if imposed. For example, tariffs on beef exports could be up to 60%. So all of these, in addition to the overall severe macroeconomic effects, we would highlight that there are parts of the economy, and it's not just the food and agriculture sector. Overall, the economy now only exports around 11.5% of our goods to the United Kingdom. In a way, that's a very misleading figure because the overall export figure is inflated by such high exports of multinationals. In fact, around 42% of the exports of indigenous firms, Irish-owned firms, go to the United Kingdom. We also import more from the UK than we export. In addition to what we import, for example, food products, consumer products and the like, around half of the imports of Irish firms are intermediate products that are used in the production of other goods and services. So these effects, which disruption to supply chains, production processes, will be encountered right across the economy, hitting particularly small and medium enterprises. And our estimates try to take into consideration all of these effects. So we think these are severe overall macroeconomic effects, and we think we will see particularly severe effects on different parts of the economy. Now, over time, we think that the overall effects will begin to level off after the first 1 or 2 years. The reason we think that is because we see two separate things happening. On the one hand, there will be parts of the economy, including parts of the agriculture, where the decline will continue beyond the first couple of years. It will be persistent. On the other hand, we have such adverse effects in the first 1 or 2 years because in many respects the economy is just not prepared. So many firms, the trading infrastructure will be taken by the suddenness of this. Over time, the economy, our ports, our customs facilities, the ability of small enterprises to fill out the new customs forms, they will adapt to an extent and they will begin to recover. Much of the economy will begin to recover, hopefully finding new export markets and the like. So you will have some reaction, a positive reaction over time, but that is not to downplay the overall seriousness of these effects. I'll come back to your second and third in a moment, but you did ask a rather technical part at the beginning about the scenario versus forecast.
Sure, so it may seem like we split hairs a bit when we say it's a scenario rather than a forecast, but methodologically there's quite a difference between the two. In the case of a forecast exercise, like say the central forecast in our bulletin, the way what we do there is that we make assumptions on all of the factors we think would impact the evolution of the Irish economy in 2019 and 2020. A scenario is a much more limited exercise. In the case of the Brexit work, we we vary only the nature of the UK's relationship with the EU. And we look at if that is the case of a no deal in this particular exercise, we look at the evolution of the economy. If the UK's relationship reverts to a no deal WTO type relationship, all other factors we think will affect the path of the Irish economy over the next 10 years are essentially held unchanged. If we were doing a forecasting exercise and you want to think about all the different aspects that would impact the growth in the economy over 10 years, you'd be thinking about other changes in the external environment, all of the other ingredients that go into a forecasting exercise. In this particular no-deal scenario analysis, we are only varying this single part, which is the nature of the UK's relationship with the EU. So it is a more limited exercise in that sense.
Deputy, I might go back to your second and third question. So the second one was in relation to the budgetary situation. So I would summarise our position in that we recommended that a more ambitious budgetary position should have been taken and larger surplus for 2019 and beyond. And our main reasoning in that regard was to leave the economy better prepared, given high current debt levels, leave the economy better prepared for Brexit or any other shocks that may be coming down the line. So we have seen in recent years, up to 2015, 2016, we saw a very substantial improvement in the public finances. That has stalled more recently, particularly, I think the best indicator of that will be the primary budget balance, in other words, a budget balance excluding interest payments, which has stabilised, even deteriorated somewhat since 2016. Our view would be, during that period, first of all, the economy has experienced extremely strong economic growth, and growth has outperformed expectations in almost every year. Second, we have seen this unprecedented surge in corporation tax revenues, and as per a previous discussion, we would have concerns that that might not be sustainable or might contain some windfall element to it. Third, the economy is also now clearly getting closer to full capacity, a time when government spending should not be seeking to add to overheating pressures or capacity constraints in the economy. And fourth, we still have extremely high public sector debt, which is still the fourth highest in the European Union, at around 105% of national income, when national income is properly measured as gross national income adjusted. For all of those reasons, we think the environment was right for a more ambitious fiscal policy and running a higher surplus, and we think this would have been particularly important, not just to reduce overheating pressures, but to increase the resilience of the economy to withstand any possible economic shocks. And of course, economic shocks, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, the risks relate not only to Brexit, but also significant risks relating to current uncertainties in the global economy, the global taxation environment and global trading regime. So hopefully, I hope that answers the second part of your question. In relation to the third part, so overall household debt remains high in Ireland by international standards. It is still measured as a proportion of household disposable income, which is the best measure. It is still the fourth highest in the European Union, standing at around 125, 130% of household disposable income. It is clearly on a downward trend. It has been on it picked up extremely quickly following the crisis. It has been on a steady downward trend for two reasons. First, households have been paying off their debt as part of a deleveraging process. But secondly, and maybe more noticeably, as household incomes increase, that ratio will decline. So it's falling by around 10 percentage points per annum. This would mean, if the current trends continue, that it would fall below 100% in the coming years. Still remaining rather high, but the more it falls, the more resilient the economy becomes to any future shock. But the position we're in now, which is, again, a legacy of the crisis, is that Irish households overall, particularly certain cohorts, particularly those age groups that bought houses during the early 2000s, those cohorts still have extremely high debt. That would make them extremely vulnerable in terms of any shock, either to incomes or shock to house prices. which reinforces the need for overall economic prudence, but is also an important reason by the bank's own contribution in this regard, which are the mortgage market measures.
Just clarify
Certainly,
something
Chair.
from my own thing.
Certainly, Chair.
When we're talking about household debt, are we therefore primarily talking about mortgage debt?
Yes,
Yeah.
I think it might be around 80% of that.
80% of household debt on average,
Yeah,
therefore.
absolutely. It dominates. I'll give you the exact figure, but it's around
Yeah,
there.
that's just
Yeah.
okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Sorry.
And just on the, you think the financial system,
Oh, sorry.
Professor Lane says it is resilient
Yes.
enough, given the terrible disaster we went through. You're confident of that?
Yeah, apologies for getting that. So the financial system, first of all, it is clearly in a far better situation than it was 2006, 2007 across so many respects. The banking system itself, the Irish banks themselves have reduced significantly their loan books. Their lending ratios have improved significantly, and their capital ratios are now significantly stronger and more robust than pre-crisis. So maybe to give a couple of examples of this. So we also have a much more intrusive supervisory system since before the crisis. The central bank itself has taken a number of actions. In addition to more intrusive supervision, the purpose of the mortgage market measures is to prevent banks from lending too much in the way that they did in the early 2000s, and to prevent borrowers and households from becoming over-indebted in the same way that they did then. The bank also, in addition to those tools, the bank has other, what we call macro-prudential tools now available to it, which we have already deployed. These are capital requirements we impose upon the bank, the ultimate objective of which is to safeguard the system of the financial the stability of the financial system as a whole. So over the past recent years, we have introduced 2 capital buffers, one a counter-cyclical capital buffer, one a buffer for large systemically important institutions, both of which serve to increase the stability of the particular banks. In the context, so we think the banking system is in a much better, much safer position, and we have introduced measures in order to ensure that that will remain the case. In terms of Brexit effects, we think that while Brexit will have a severe overall economic impact, we think that some temporary market dislocation cannot be ruled out. Overall, we think that the risks to the overall financial system as a result of Brexit are manageable, but this is something that we are monitoring very carefully within the bank.
Thank you very much. Deputy O'Brien.
I think a lot of it has been asked, so I'll be brief enough. Just in relation to some of the challenges, obviously Brexit being the big one, but you're very quick to point out that that's not the only factor as well. And you talk about the other factors. So can I just touch on employment and housing and non-commercial properties as well, and just what factors they're playing into it. I think from reading the report, what we're seeing is we're obviously reaching full employment. So we're now seeing a transition of employment across sectors, and that's leading to wage increases. That's my reading of it anyway, in summary. So how much of that is going to actually play into possible risks of overheating the economy?
Yes.
Also, one of the other areas in the report which it touched on is the area of housing, and you're saying that we're almost reaching a point where we're at maximum in terms of our build because of the skills shortages, because we're reaching full employment, and that may have a factor. One of the things I don't understand is in your report you talk about non-commercial property maintaining a very moderate level of growth, but yet in the IFAC reports that we've seen, and including the department reports, what we're seeing is that the greater risk to the economy in terms of overheating is coming from the non-commercial, it's coming from the commercial sector rather than the non-commercial sector. And I just wonder if you could just briefly discuss that and how we could address that, because we only have so many workers in the construction sector. If we're reaching full employment, then how do we overcome them? The second one is in relation to just in relation to property prices themselves. We're seeing more properties becoming available in the Dublin area for rent. I think we've seen an increase of about 7.1% more properties are available to rent in Dublin, and as a result we're seeing a slight decrease in rental prices in Dublin. That's not been replicated outside of Dublin. I think we're seeing less properties becoming available for rent, so I think the figures in your quarterly bulletin is 4.5% decrease in the number of properties for rent outside of Dublin, and obviously rental prices are going up. So the report indicates that there is a huge issue with supply and demand outside of Dublin. But the figure in terms of the Dublin region actually took me by surprise, because when we hear about housing supply, Dublin always seems to be an area where there is very little supply. Yet your report is saying that we're actually seeing an increase in the number of properties which are available for rent. I don't know if, obviously not questioning the figures, but I mean that's not the kind of information that we would get coming through constituency offices, coming through debates in the Oireachtas. What we're hearing is that Dublin is at absolute saturation. There is no place to rent in Dublin, but that's not borne out in your own analysis in the report. And I just wondered if you could briefly touch on that as well.
Okay, thank you very much, Deputy. Let me address each of these three issues as I see them. I'm not entirely sure which parts of the report you're.
Okay, the one on we get it up there. The one on the house prices anyway is on page 40.
Oh yeah. Perfect. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's on 44.
Yeah, I have them. Thank you, Deputy. These are extremely important. All of them are extremely important issues at the moment for the economy. Let me first of all deal with the issue of overheating and employment trends. First, I think it is very important to emphasise that we do not currently see overheating in the economy. Prices, wages remain contained. We are certainly not, unlike a decade ago, we are certainly not seeing any signs of that economic growth is being fuelled by either excessive domestic credit or by foreign inflows of money from abroad. The situation is very different from then. At the same time, we are seeing that the unemployment rate has been falling steadily. We are getting closer to a position of full capacity, and we're seeing signs of increasing tightness in the labour market. And the ones we would point to in that regard, first of all, we have clearly seen an uptick in wages. There were figures released this week that showed that the average increase in weekly wages during the final quarter of last year was 4.1%, up from 3.5% in the previous quarter. We've also seen an increase in job vacancy rates, which is now at a high level, historically high level. We've also seen an increase in job switching rates, the rate at which people are switching jobs within an economy, and we've produced an analysis of this year which shows that this tends to be an indicator that further wage increases are on the way. So we are seeing, while we don't currently see overheating, we are seeing signs of getting closer to full capacity. In terms of looking within the labour market, we're seeing that some sectors are clearly experiencing more pressures in terms of a shortage of available workers, which is leading to higher wages in those sectors. The sector that stands out particularly will be the information and communication technology services sector. So that's a very fast-growing sector. You're seeing wages increasing by maybe 7%, which is maybe what you would expect. Across many parts of the rest of the economy, so unemployment growth is strongest in the construction sector, and I'll come back to that in a moment because I think that relates also to the second part of your question. So employment in construction increased by about 11% over the past year. We're also seeing strong employment growth in accommodation and food services, in sectors like education, public administration. So this is what we mean when we say it's quite broad-based across the economy. Wage increases are fastest and the vacancy rates are highest in some of the modern services sectors. So we're seeing a high vacancy rate apart from information and communication technology. We're also seeing it in financial services, professional services. Wage pressure is more contained in other more traditional parts of the economy. So our concern is really not that we currently see overheating, but just looking out for whether wages and prices do start to increase at a faster rate than might be justified by the performance of the economy. We are not seeing this now. The increase in wages we're seeing across the economy is very welcome, particularly since the wage cuts, wage moderation experienced by so many after the crisis. It is right that the benefits of economic growth are being spread. So this is really a cautionary word about just ensuring that we do not get into the situation of the past. In terms of the housing market overall, so I would say a couple of things here relating to supply, relating to labour demands within housing, relating to the differences between the different elements of the sector. The first thing I would note is that we certainly share the consensus that the main issue currently facing the housing market is a shortage of supply. So housing supply last year was around 18,000 units, which is extremely low in comparison to the needs of the economy. The medium-term needs of the economy are probably somewhere closer to 40,000 units a year, so 18,000 last year was well short of this. Housing supply is clearly picking up at a strong rate. It's increasing by maybe 25% a year, but this still only brings us up to about 23,000 units this year, 28,000 next year. So even by 2020, we think the amount of houses being built will still not be enough to meet the needs of the economy. This means that you are going to see pressures manifesting themselves in both prices and rents. What we've actually seen is that the pressures in the rental market have been much greater over a number of years than in the housing market. In fact, if you look back since the crisis, house prices are still around 20% below where they were in 2007, whereas rents are now significantly above where they were at that time. In terms of some of the other trends you mentioned, so in terms of the regional trends, Dublin, it is absolutely right. So after the crisis, prices began to pick up first in Dublin. That was then followed by the rest of the country. Now we're seeing that the rate of price increases across Dublin as a whole, and you mentioned also the rate of rental increases, is less than in the rest of the country. So price increases in Dublin are now only running at maybe 3.5–4% a year, compared to around 6%, 6.5% nationwide. This probably reflects a couple of factors. One factor may be that you had the pickup in prices earlier in Dublin, but I think there's probably an affordability factor here also. The prices and rents rose to a high enough rate within Dublin, they became less affordable, and this tends to push the pressures out towards regions outside of Dublin. We've actually seen another interesting trend in the housing market is that prices are increasing at a much faster rate at lower levels of prices. In fact, prices are flat or even declining at much higher levels. And one consequence of this is because price levels tend to be higher in Dublin, you do therefore see a slower rate of increase in Dublin as a whole. In terms of the supply of houses, so we've done analysis in terms of what is required in order to address the deficit in the housing sector in the coming years. In particular, a key factor we identify will be the availability of construction sector workers. And I might actually, in fact, the author of this analysis was Thomas, so I don't know, would you like to say something about?
Sure. So I think you pointed to the tight labour market position for construction workers, and that's true. One aspect of this is we looked at what happened to construction workers who lost their jobs during the crash, so in the period 2009 to 13. And what we found there essentially is that a significant number of the individuals who lost work in that sector had either moved into other jobs or emigrated. So we didn't find evidence of a significant pool of unemployed construction workers in Ireland currently. So I think you used the phrase that we're running out of construction workers. One important aspect in Ireland has been the role of migration. So we saw this during the previous boom. The labour market is extremely open. In good times, we see significant inflows, and we saw outflows during the downturn. And we saw last year, in the year to April, a net inflow of 34,000 workers. So even though the domestic labour supply of construction workers is likely to be quite low, you're correct. On past experience, we have seen inflows of workers to sectors with labour scarcities. So it is true that should help ease labour shortages in tight sectors. But of course, a pick-up in inward migration creates pressures in other parts of the economy.
Such as rentals?
In housing and in other areas, yes. So it certainly helps in terms of labour supply constraints, and that's very important. But it does have consequences for other parts of the economy.
So let me just maybe one more thing about inward migration as a kind of a factor in terms of the construction sector output, and then I might mention something in terms of, you mentioned also the supply of rental properties in Dublin versus otherwise. So we've had some interesting developments in that. So in terms of migration, I suppose, as Thomas says, construction workers, essentially foreign construction workers, left the country after when the crisis hit, and we have not seen a significant return in that regard. It's only since 2015 that net inward migration has turned positive, but it's turning positive at quite a quick rate. So last year, for example, we had 34,000 more people coming into the country than left the country, coming to look for work. So this is alleviating somewhat the labour supply constraints. Particularly, we're seeing in the construction sector, construction is increasing, but there is paradoxically some additional pressures on demand because of these workers needing places to live. The overall effect will be still a positive effect from net inward migration in the sector, in that it will add more to the supply of housing than it will reduce the demand, but it does offset it somewhat. Within the rental market, so one significant change that is currently occurring within the rental market, and indeed within the overall commercial property market, relates to the financing of investment and the financing of this sector. Commercial investment and the buy-to-let rental sector are no longer being financed by the banking sector. Essentially, finance in this area is now coming from equity investment and institutional investment, which has a lot of different effects, positive and negative effects. There's some positive effects in terms of risk sharing. There may be some positive effects in terms of the stability, long-term stability of the rental market, in terms of this type of institutional type of apartment ownership, which can sign longer contracts and the like. But of course, it does also create an additional demand within the economy for a fixed supply of housing. So it is a material, there are advantages, disadvantages, but it is a material change to the structure of the commercial market, and it affects not just commercial properties like offices and retail and industrial, but it significantly affects also the rental apartments in particular, apartment rental markets in particular, and we're seeing that. And maybe the trend you mentioned, where we're seeing more availability within Dublin, less in other countries, maybe this partly reflects that, maybe this partly reflects institutional investment within Dublin apartments, where rents would be higher, and therefore maybe the incentives for this type of purchases. This is something we're looking within the bank. The impact of the non-banking financing upon the overall property market is a key research theme for us within the bank. It's something we're hoping to publish more on this year. It's an important trend. I hope that answers all your questions, Deputy.
Thank you very much. Now, do I have Deputy Chambers?
Thank you very much, Chair. Apologies for not being here earlier. The Brexit legislation is going through the House, so we're kind of in and out of the chamber all day dealing with that. But thank you for coming to the Budget Committee, and my questions will focus on Brexit and any insight you can provide into that. Just, I suppose I was struck by the comments of Governor Lane when he spoke recently in Dublin Castle, and he said that the immediate cliff edge risks of a hard Brexit have largely been addressed because of the work of the central bank. So could you go into a little bit more detail as to what exactly you've done to, what were the immediate cliff edge risks that you had identified, and what steps did you take to address those? Also, he spoke about the redistribution of financial services away from London as kind of, I suppose, the centre point within the European Union. And he said that would bring challenges as well as opportunities. I think the opportunities are clear and that we would hope to get some of those relocating to Dublin. But what do you see as the challenges of that in terms of for Ireland if companies do relocate here, or if indeed we are dealing with the more kind of, I suppose, dispersed financial services markets across the EU member states? Just in terms of the key financial risks to the economy, obviously there are more than just Brexit, but would you consider Brexit to be the biggest threat that we're facing currently? And in terms of, I suppose, our government's planning for Brexit, do you think that we are sufficiently prepared right now, today, for a disorderly or no-deal Brexit at the end of March? And if not, what do we need to do now to get ourselves prepared for over the next 30 days?
Okay, thank you very much, Deputy. There's a number of issues there. Maybe I'll start with the last one because it will, really to make the point that I can say more about our own preparations in the Central Bank, which is the first part of your question, than I can about the government's preparations. I do know we've had very close interaction with the Department of Finance over recent years, so I know a lot of work is going in within the government, but really I'm in terms of preparations outside of the financial sector, I'm less close to that. I can't say too much. Are we as an economy prepared for end March? I'd say as much as any other economy, but essentially not fully prepared. I don't think any country in Europe, including the United Kingdom ourselves, are fully prepared for no-deal Brexit. If we had known, if anybody had known a year ago what the outcome at 29th of March would be, then firms, the government, could all have prepared for that outcome, but there has been such significant uncertainty. There have been different possible scenarios that the degree of preparedness, I think, was never going to be 100% for the most adverse scenario. Let me mention, so in terms of what we've done across the bank as a whole, and this is moving outside, I suppose, within our remit on the macroeconomic side, our advice is providing economic analysis, commentary. We've done quite a bit of that. But I think you're talking more about, in terms of financial system, financial stability, supervisory issues. So, first of all, the bank has been working on these since well before the referendum itself. I remember having our first meetings about preparations for the potential of Brexit back in around the summer or autumn of 2015, and we've worked intensively since that, so 3.5-year period, on potential Brexit risks. The type of work we've done, we've engaged closely with the banks in terms of ensuring that they have sufficient capital and have undertaken stress tests in order to be able to withstand all Brexit scenarios. From the outset, we've emphasised in all of our communications that while a no-deal Brexit was not the most likely outcome, it was always a possible outcome, and that's always been a part of
in fairness, you have always said that.
Our advice. As we've come closer, some of you mentioned cliff edge risks. Let me give an example of some of the cliff edge risks that have come on our radar over recent months and quarters, and that we have had to address in many times along with the Department of Finance because we have shared responsibilities. So there was a risk to the settlement of Irish securities in the event of a no-deal Brexit. Within the whole European framework, there was risks in relation to the settlement of derivatives. Both of these risks have now been mitigated by European-level legislation, which allows for the settlement of securities and derivatives to be continued for 2 years in one case, 3 years in another, beyond the Brexit deadline of 29th of March. We had concerns over the continuity of insurance contracts post-Brexit, that if there were insurance providers into this jurisdiction that were no longer authorised after Brexit came into effect, what would the status of existing contracts for Irish citizens with those companies be? And as we're, well, at the moment, the legislation as part of the overall legislative package announced last week, legislation to allow the run-off of these insurance contracts to occur over the next 2 years was announced by the government and will be hopefully come into effect in early March. We've also been dealing with a very large number of authorisations for new applicants to come into Ireland, which we have been engaging successfully with in terms of the size of the sector. And you mentioned then the challenges from firms locating here. So I won't talk about any individual firms, but what we will see, in addition to a substantial increase in the size of the balance sheet of the Irish financial sector as a result of Brexit, we will also see new types of business models attracted here. Very sophisticated business models. So this has involved challenges. We've known this has been on the horizon. So in terms of upskilling, in terms of our interactions, liaising with other supervisors to ensure that we are fully prepared to fully supervise all aspects of the business models of these new types of operations. So really we've done a lot in that regard. Is Brexit the biggest threat? It's clearly the most immediate threat. If a no-deal Brexit materialises, it would be certainly the largest threat the economy has faced since going back to the financial crisis. Over the longer term, I'm not inclined to really rank them. I think we will know about Brexit sooner rather than later. I think the figures I mentioned earlier, when I gave some of the figures, if a deal is agreed, the aggregate figures are reasonably large, but not excessive, with the very important consideration that certain sectors of the economy, agri-food, would be severely affected. But I think the risks that we're seeing in relation to the global taxation environment, risks in relation to potential protectionist threats. Ireland is one of the, probably about the 4th or 5th most open economy in the world. We have a very high degree of reliance on multinational, a small number of multinational firms. We also have a high degree of reliance on a number of sectors, a high degree of sectoral specialisation. So around 55% of our goods exports are in the chemicals and pharmaceuticals sector. Around 47–50% of our services exports are in IT-type services. So there are vulnerabilities there. We would be particularly affected if any of these, if there was an escalation in protectionist trends or any changes to global taxation arrangements which would affect us. So I think they're all material risks. Brexit in the short term, certainly the most immediate and kind of certainly most in focus, but I certainly would not underplay the medium term, the other medium term risks.
Thank you. The Commission have suggested that it's possible that in the event of a no deal that we could see Ireland going into a recession. I mean, would you agree with that assessment?
Well, I think it's not, our estimates, which point to very significant adverse effects, particularly in the first 2 years after no-deal Brexit. They point to growth being around 4% lower in the first year than in our main forecast, and a further 2% lower in the second year. This, we expect, would still leave positive growth over those periods, probably of around 1–1.5% in each year, compared to 4.5% and 3%. So our scenario in the event of a no-deal Brexit is for materially weaker growth, but avoiding recession and output and employment growth both remaining positive. I would emphasise the inherent uncertainty regarding these estimates. We do not have prior experience of the type of shock and disruption that a no-deal Brexit will result. So either better or worse outcomes than those cannot be ruled out.
And just to follow on from that then, if we're looking at the potential for a drop in growth of up to 4%, we've had the Minister for Finance, Paschal Donoghue, here before the committee, and we asked the question, and I asked the question, did he foresee the need to have a supplementary budget mid-cycle? And he was very adamant that there was no need and that there was enough there across departments to deal with whatever might come. I think that sounds strange, given that we don't know what's coming. But what would your assessment be of that particular position from the Minister for Finance?
Well, First of all, it is very clear that in the event of a no-deal Brexit and the adverse implications that I've just mentioned that the Department of Finance also spells out, then the path for the public finances and as a result the appropriate policy response would be somewhat different, including our own policy advice in that regard. So in the scenario that what we think is a more likely scenario, whereby a no-deal Brexit is avoided, then we would like to see, for the reasons I mentioned earlier, we would like to see larger budget surpluses than are currently envisaged. Yeah. In the event that there is a disruptive no-deal Brexit, then despite the fact that public sector debt is still high, the state of the public finances does allow, in that situation, for the running of a counter-cyclical fiscal deficit through the operation of what we call the automatic stabilisers on tax revenues and transfer payments. So what we mean by this is that the public finance situation automatically, without the need for a budget, it automatically alters in the case of an economic shock. So because of lower incomes, people will pay less tax. Government spending on unemployment benefits and other transfers increases. And in fact, the increase in benefit spending and the lower tax collection helps to limit it keeps more money in the economy, and it helps to limit the fall in aggregate demand and to cushion the impact of the shock. So automatically, these are what we call automatic stabilisers. Automatically, there is some relief for the economy without the need for the budget, albeit that the deficit situation worsens, but that is appropriate in those circumstances. The state of the public finances does allow for that. I would say, without getting into whether or not a supplementary budget would be required, I'm certainly not saying that it would be required, but I think that beyond those automatic stabilisers, I think the nature of a hard Brexit, what it involves in terms of the impact on the economy and possible changes to the structure, the nature of a hard Brexit would allow for some one-off measures. Okay? It would allow for one-off measures which might be used, for example, to support Brexit trade routes, or maybe targeted measures at those parts of the economy that are particularly affected by Brexit. So I think in addition to automatic stabilisers, there would be scope for some one-off measures to alleviate the effects and to help the adjustment of the economy towards a new post-Brexit situation. The nature of those will be up for government, of course. The critical factor I would emphasise is they need to be explicitly temporary measures. We need to avoid permanent spending commitments that we may not be able to finance over the longer term, particularly if there was to be a shock to corporation tax revenues or another shock to the economy.
I mean things like increasing public sector pay, which we've seen.
It would not be appropriate for me to discuss any individual. It's a matter for government.
It's a political issue.
Yeah, it is. We're very happy to provide views on the overall state of the public finance. We're not none of us are elected officials. It's not appropriate in terms of individual specific tax or spending measures or prioritisation. They are appropriately political.
Of course, Mr. Cassidy. Just one final question, Chair, and it's just on the, in relation to the quarterly bulletin that you published. It raises the prospect that we might see an increase in foreign direct investment as a result of Brexit. And just wondering, what evidence was that based on? How likely is that to happen? What extent do you see it increasing? And just if you could maybe give us a little bit more detail as to the thinking and the process behind coming to that conclusion.
Yes, certainly. So yes, we would expect to see an increase in foreign direct investment, particularly over the medium term. We think this will be one of the, I suppose, the mitigating effects, which will reduce somewhat the longer-term impact on Brexit. The reason being that most of the foreign direct, much of the foreign direct investment that locates, all of the foreign direct investment that locates here is to sell their goods and services outside of Ireland. Much of that is to sell to EU markets. So around 40% of our exports are to other EU, non-UK, other EU countries. So once the UK is no longer a part of the UK, then international firms have less incentive to locate in the UK with a view to selling into the open single market in the EU, and if they're looking for alternative locations, Ireland may be the optimal location. So you may either see a redirection of foreign direct investment that is currently in the UK being redirected here, or new investment that is seeking to locate in the EU, which previously might have considered the UK as a prime option, may instead come to Ireland. So we would expect to see an increase in FDI. We are seeing very tangible signs of that in the financial sector. So there's a good reason for that. In the financial sector, you need to get authorisation in order to locate, and therefore financial sector services firms need to have been making their plans much earlier than in many other sectors, and therefore we have, as I mentioned already, we've seen a very large increase in authorisation applications in the financial services sector, and we will see significant new investments in that sector. Outside of the financial services sector, we would expect to see a positive impact. The extent of that is a little uncertain still. It will take a little bit longer. Firms probably have more capacity to wait and see what exactly the nature of the new arrangements will be before they make definitive plans. We don't have estimates ourselves as to what the positive impact on growth would be, but I've seen estimates, I've seen estimates whereby it might add about 3% to the level of output because of higher foreign direct investment over the medium to longer term. So
that's positive.
One thing that in terms of the FDI, Mark mentioned one of the drivers of potentially higher FDI in Ireland will be the diversion of FDI from the UK. And it's just important to note that a lot of the studies for the UK on the impact of Brexit, one of the effects they expect to see in the UK is a reduction in FDI inflows to the UK, and in the event of the Brexit being a WTO type shock, the numbers are quite big, so a reduction of about a quarter, about 25% reduction in UK FDI. So the partial diversion of some of that to Ireland in line with, say, its current share of FDI will be a reasonable expectation. And that's essentially what we try to include in the simulations. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Just before I go to Deputy Barrett, I know has some questions. I just want to follow up on something what Deputy Chambers was saying. In relation to that answer, then, that I presume would be that investment would be predicated on the harder the exit, the harder the Brexit out of the system. Would that development be delayed if you had an agreed soft Brexit with ongoing negotiations in terms of the foreign, the future arrangements? And would you expect to see that level of investment would not necessarily happen until that future relationship period was negotiations were concluded?
So first of all, whether it's a hard or a soft Brexit would have an impact on the amount of foreign direct investment we would likely see here, but we would still expect to see some more foreign direct investment even in the event of the softer Brexit scenarios. There are two reasons for this. First, the hard Brexit, soft Brexit has less of an impact upon trade and services. So trade and services, once Brexit takes place, whether it's hard or soft Brexit, there will no longer be passporting of services between the UK and the rest of the EU. So under all circumstances, the incentives, as long as Brexit takes place, as long as the UK is not a part of the single market, then the incentives for foreign direct investment to locate here, particularly in services, will still exist. So there will still be a benefit under both circumstances. Even in goods, while there may be a free trade agreement, as long as the UK is not in both a single market, where there are no regulatory checks, or a customs union, where there are no customs checks to check rules of origin, then even in a free trade agreement, there will still be barriers to trade. So it will still not be unrestricted access for UK exports of goods into the EU. These will be less in the case of a deal than in the case of a no deal with tariffs and the like. Therefore, in summary, you would expect to see some advantage or some more FDI flows under all circumstances, but the incentives will be even more in the event of a no deal. In terms of the timing, certainly The scenario where there is a deal, which we still think is the most likely, that involves a transition period up to 2020. That allows firms a lot more time to prepare their investment strategies. I certainly do not see any benefit in the no-deal scenario, even in foreign direct investment. I think far and away the suddenness of the change to the arrangements just leads to uncertainty, decline in sentiment right across the economy, including exporting sectors. And then the more disruptive nature, the bigger the change in the new trading arrangements, equally adds a lot more in terms of trade frictions, trade costs and the like. So we would benefit under FDI under both circumstances. I do not see any silver lining in the...
I think we could all agree on that. Deputy Barrett. Barrett.
A question to kind of follow on from that. I can see that point, but what particular sectors do you think are going to be hurt? Could you just be a bit more specific? I mean, look at your chemical, you mentioned chemicals. In fact, the graphs are quite stunning, really, in terms of the contribution that chemical exports have made to export growth. Yes. I think your graph shows that without increased chemical exports, our exports would be negative, which is pretty stark indication of the reliance on one particular sector. Yes. I presume another sector that's contributed very significantly to our growth over recent years is the whole IT sector. Yes. I don't see either of those being significantly impacted by Brexit one way or another. I think your own commentary suggests that most of that export growth is going to the United States and Belgium. Interestingly, Belgium. You know, the IT stuff I don't think would be significantly impacted. I wouldn't have thought. I think if I understood what you're saying in the area of financial services, if anything, there could be a positive spin-off for us. So no particular negative impact there. So where are the negative impacts going to be? I mean, I presume the negative impacts are going to be in agribusiness because of the huge export of agricultural output to Britain, and tourism, I would imagine, would be a sector that we might fear would be hit. But I'd just be interested to see your comments on that, and to what extent does your analysis take into account the swings and roundabouts of that? But, like, I'd be interested to hear your answer on it, but doesn't all of this show, really, does Brexit crisis highlight much more deep-rooted structural weaknesses in the Irish economy that need to be addressed no matter what happens with Brexit? Soft or hard, which is we're massively over-reliant on a few sectors. And that if problems emerge in any of them, the economy is in very serious trouble. And if that is true, what should we be doing about it? I mean, obviously, diversification of the economy is what is needed, I would have thought. But, you know, do you think Ireland is actually moving to take serious steps to diversify the economy, or is it, in fact, still is industrial policy sort of concentrated on growing those sectors and potentially growing our increased vulnerability over the medium to long term?
Yeah. Thank you, Deputy. I'll try to address each of those in turn. Let me first refer specifically to the chemical sector, including the context of the figures you refer to. And the fact you refer to is absolutely correct. I can update it slightly because we have a bit more data. So we saw overall strong export growth in the economy last year. If you exclude the contribution of the chemical sector, it was in fact about zero. It was slightly negative at the time we wrote the box. We have an additional 2 months' data. So effectively, there would have been no overall export growth in the economy last year without the chemical sector. I would, a figure I mentioned earlier on in terms of our exports, and I'll come back to this because it's very relevant for the last part of your question. 55% of our goods exports are chemicals and pharmaceuticals. 47% of our services exports are IT services. So there is this high degree of sectoral reliance that you refer to, and I will come back to that because it's very relevant for your last part of your question. Chemicals, we export a lot of chemicals to the UK. We don't think this is a sector that's going to be particularly affected. There's no tariffs in the chemical sector. Non-tariff barriers are much less. This is a highly profitable sector anyway. So this, when we talk about sectoral effects, while a high proportion of chemical exports go to the UK, we do not have chemicals in mind. We do very much have in mind the agri-food sector, and I'll come to that. We also have in mind Irish exporters across other parts of the economy, not just the agri-food sector. So Irish exports to the UK from Ireland are only now 11.5% of our total exports. That is a very misleading figure, because that total export figure is boosted so much by the chemicals exports, and that's a good figure. 43% of the exports of Irish-owned firms go to the UK. So Irish-owned firms are extremely vulnerable to Brexit effects. So let me first mention the food and agriculture sector, and then I'll maybe mention some of these other SMEs. So the food and agriculture sector, last year 42% of our food exports went to the UK. So within that, parts like beef, other meat products, dairy are very exposed. Tariffs on food products are far and away the highest of any type of products. So the SRI has estimated that the effective tariff in a no-deal Brexit, the effective tariff on meat products will be 59%, almost 60%. On dairy products, 47%. Food and agriculture products also really involves moving goods, time-sensitive goods, fresh produce, which needs to be moved quickly. Agricultural products are also most subject to regulatory delays, phytosanitary checks and the like. So the food and agriculture sector is undoubtedly extremely vulnerable to a no-deal hard Brexit. The SRI has estimated that whereas overall exports to the UK could fall by 20% in the worst-case scenario, the decline in exports of beef could be 65%, the decline in exports of dairy could be 60%. So that is one sector that is extremely exposed to a disorderly no-deal Brexit. But we also have a lot of SMEs, Irish-owned SMEs, across a range of sectors which are particularly exposed. So I think around 93% of the number of firms that export to the UK are Irish-owned SMEs. Around half of those have no export market apart from the United Kingdom. So there's a lot of firms in other sectors of the economy that will also be affected. In addition to that, even small and medium enterprises that do not export to the UK, many of them import intermediate products from the UK. The restrictions on trade, the trade frictions and the like, will increase the costs, may reduce the availability of those intermediate products, impacting on the supply chains and production process of SME sectors. So really, what parts of the economy are affected really is permeating all parts of the indigenous sector, the Irish-owned sector, rather than the multinational sector, which tends to be much more diversified. They tend to have much more experience and skills in exporting to different countries at the same time, as well as being less vulnerable to tariffs and non-tariff barriers. So they're the sectors of the economy we think are most exposed. In terms of the multinational sector, I agree with the fact that we are extremely reliant on the multinational sector. I think the multinational sector has served and continues to serve Ireland extremely well. It contributes very significantly in terms of employment created, in terms of revenues for the Exchequer, in terms of contribution to overall growth. It creates higher paid employment than other sectors of the economy, and there are also evidence, maybe not as much as we would like, but evidence also of skills transfers to other parts of the economy. that needs to be balanced against, first, that there is a very high degree of reliance. We've mentioned some of the sectoral effects in a moment, but it's also the case that the top 5 multinationals account for around 33%, one-third of goods exports. So first of all, we are vulnerable to any downturn in these multinationals, whether that is a shock to one of these individual firms, a shock to one of these sectors, chemicals and pharmaceuticals or computer services, or just a shock to the global trading arrangements. We are very vulnerable. The other potential impact would be if the multinational sector crowds out the indigenous sector as opposed to being a complementary force within the economy. So if the multinational sector was to be able to afford pay higher wages, getting more skilled workers or capital. So really, I think what you need to ensure is not, I think, a change to the economic model, I strongly think we need to continue to encourage the multinational sector, provide a supportive environment. At the same time, complementary to that, to reduce those 2 risks, we need to do 2 things. First of all, the public finances cannot be overly reliant upon the revenues from the multinational sector and the corporation tax revenues, which are so high at 19% of revenues. And second, we do need to ensure that we do have a dynamic, successful indigenous sector of the economy. And I think, if anything, Brexit will accelerate the diversification in terms of exports, because a lot of producers will need to find new markets there. So I think developing that sector, supporting that sector, needs to be a very important part of policy.
Yeah, I'm not so sure we're doing so well in the last bit, but anyway, leave that discussion for another day. The other thing, one thing I found quite striking was the table on page 73 of government net financial wealth fell by 2.3 billion during Q2 2018 as the increase in liabilities outstripped the increase in financial assets. That was, I found, quite striking. And I'm just wondering if you could comment on what these liabilities are, and what you think the significance of that might be.
Sorry, which chart?
This is your quarterly report, isn't it? Yeah. Quarterly bulletin, yeah. Central Bank.
Which chart? Oh yeah, here it is. Sorry, chart 32. Yeah. The chart. Yeah, I have it here. Right.
Oh, the chart.
Yeah,
sorry, the
sorry.
chart. What chart? Chart 32.
32. Yeah. Sorry, yeah.
Chart 32. But I'm just curious about that, and I just wonder. Yeah, I'd just be interested in your comments on what these liabilities are and what's the significance of the government's net financial wealth falling. And I kind of, in my own head, I'm somewhat connecting it with a policy I'm very strongly opposed to, which the government have pursued over recent years. And you kind of touched on it earlier, which is the sale of huge amounts of property-related assets to these institutional investors that you're talking about, who've moved in on Irish property, with NAMA and the banks selling off an awful lot of property to them. Something that, to my mind, doesn't make sense, because those are assets that the state had in its hands, and revenue-producing assets, which could have counterbalanced this. And in fact, when you look at the extend to
just get the question.
that's what I'm doing. When you look at the extent to which the government's housing plans, particularly in social housing, are dependent on renting back property from the people we sold it to through HAPS, RAS and social leasing schemes, where property we sold to NAMA the NAMA sold to these people that you were referring to, the institutional investors. Those people are now going to rent it back to the state. I
just want to ask you, I know what you're saying and we know your views, but you asked a question as to what the chart is, and I'd like.
I'm asking, is it connected, or would we be in a different position? Would our financial assets be greater if we had held on to that stuff?
So I cannot give you a complete answer because I don't have the breakdown here, so I apologize. I would just, on the chart you're referring to, it's the asset side, which is above the line, the financial asset side, seems to have been reasonably stable for about the 5-6 years. The large increase in the negative net financial wealth position clearly represents the increase, a massive increase in liabilities after the crisis hit, when government borrowing increased enormously. It seems to have stabilised since around 2014, so I think that the text is maybe a single quarter figure, which at the very last one seems to have declined.
Unless it relates just to the timing of debt issuance.
Yeah.
So it may just be a time.
Okay, but one of the big things one of the big assets is property. Okay.
Sorry, I'm going to be just a little bit direct here. If you don't have the specific knowledge on this, I'd prefer you came back to us with it, because you can't interpret a chart for your viewpoint deputy and then ask them to agree with it if they don't know. If they can't
let
give
me
us
ask the question.
But if they can't give us the
let me ask
answer,
the question.
I want for clarity to say if you don't have that information today, can you come back to the deputy and come back to the committee on it?
Certainly. Our suspicion is it's an issuance of debt. Let us come back to you on it, because it is financial assets. So. Financial liabilities. So
but my question is in particular is what is the impact on the government's asset and liabilities position as a result of selling off quite large amounts of property assets? So if you want to come back to me on it, I'd be very happy. And the consequence of also then having to rent a lot of that stuff back, and the cost, the outgoings in is that included in the liabilities? The projected expenditure?
I'd need to get back to you on what's underpinning those figures.
Sure. Just very last question. One other table which I'm always interested in is the household wealth.
Can I just say, Deputy, we did this very extensively earlier on, household debt and wealth, and but just to go through,
Thanks. Household wealth in this country is now, if I read your table correctly, as great as it's ever been, and has increased very dramatically, both in terms of financial and property assets. If you marry that with the CSO Silk reports on the distribution of those assets, which show a very high concentration, I think the top 10% own 58% of it. Would you see that as a vulnerability? The over-concentration of wealth, property wealth and financial wealth, in the hands of a very small number of people? If we're talking about risks and vulnerabilities for an economy, would you see that as a vulnerability?
I think there are a lot of important issues in relation to the wealth distribution. I think from a vulnerability perspective, it will probably be the distribution of those in indebtedness that is maybe more the vulnerability. And I think there are very important and interesting distributional trends within these aggregate figures. So on the debt side, we see that while overall indebtedness, that is what is below the line here, while overall indebtedness has declined significantly, Irish household debt is still the 4th highest in Europe, and there are certain cohorts within that, particularly 35 to 45 age group, who are still extremely highly indebted. That generation that purchased property just before the crisis, during the early 2000s. So from a kind of wealth, indebtedness, net worth perspective, I think that is the greater vulnerability, the vulnerability of that cohort to a shock to either income or house prices.
Sorry, I want to follow up on a question from Deputy Boyd Barrett's thing. Shock to income, shock to house prices. Also, just could you add into that? Now, I think probably because of the way the global economy is going and everything, this is less likely. but the risk of interest rate rises.
Yes.
To that must be one of the most very substantial risks to that group, because anecdotally there's an awful lot of people who have managed to bring their monthly thing into line because of the reduction in interest rates, who would be extremely vulnerable. I mean, how would you equate interest rate rises versus the other factors you mentioned there?
Yeah, I agree, Chair. I think we have had a sustained period of extremely low official interest rates, while mortgage interest rates for those on variable interest rates have been higher than in other European countries. We have a very high cohort of borrowers who are on tracker interest rates. In fact, the share of tracker interest rates among those who bought at just before the crisis, and therefore who are the most vulnerable cohort, the share of tracker mortgages is extremely high. So those mortgage holders, while they may have suffered negative equity and reductions in their wealth because of prices, have been protected to an extent from an affordability perspective by the fact that tracker mortgage rates have remained so low. Once official interest rates begin to increase, then that cohort will start to see an increase in their repayments for the first time. There is a potential financial stability risk there. I think the length of time that has gone on, most borrowers have been paying down their debt, so the vulnerability has reduced. But I think there is a cohort for individuals particularly. I think there is still a cohort who are highly indebted, who will find their repayment burden increasing significantly when interest rates rise, which increases the risk to a shock, but also even under normal circumstances, they will find themselves more stretched. And again, it's something where you need to look at different groupings. The aggregate figures mask it somewhat, but particular groupings within society, particularly that maybe 35 to 45 who bought at the peak of the crisis, are vulnerable to higher interest rates. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for that. I'd like to just conclude. There's couple of questions, or one question in particular. It might be a bit too early to ask you this, but just VAT changes and the impact. I don't know if you've seen any. It's only a couple of months, obviously, but if you've seen any indications that VAT changes that took place at the start of the year have had any substantial economic impact or change?
It will be too early. We don't have any data yet that would confirm that. We'll
Right. Well, listen, I would like to thank you very much, Mr. Cassidy, for coming in along with your colleagues. It's been a very interesting exchange. I know some of the deputies who were asked you earlier on are no longer here. But I think on behalf of all the committee, it's been a really, really informative and interesting exchange, and we thank you for spending your time with us today. As there is no further business, I'd like to conclude the proceedings. Our meeting will now stand adjourned until Tuesday, the 5th of March at 4 p.m.
Thank you.